Hey, what's up everybody? BDO44 coming at you in another video. Alright, so I don't know how this is going to look when I record it. I'm kind of recording from a different angle. Eating breakfast right now. So you can see the bowl full of oatmeal. It doesn't taste that great, not enough sweetness to that bowl. But talk about Darvin Ham's rotations. I was listening to Laker Nation just now, and they were really upset at the new starting lineup. And my thing is, I'm playing against the Charlotte Hornets, so I don't want to sit up here and act like the starting lineup was just a raging success against anybody. Because depending on who you're playing, certain things will work. Depending on who you're playing, certain things will not. But, I think the biggest misconception that I see, one of the biggest misconceptions I see about basketball is the importance of putting all of your best stuff in the starting lineup. And how that is supposed to be either a promotion or a demotion in NBA basketball. It is as it pertains to agent games, as I like to call it, or contractual things for which a guy, if he starts, he gets a bump in his pay, or if he starts, he gets this or that. More negotiation, leverage, and things like that about a guy's contract if he's a starter, which I think is something that needs to evolve, given what it is I'm going to say here. It doesn't often strategize the best way to put everybody in positions throughout the course of a game to get the most out of them. If I'm pushing all my best stuff to the front, then maybe some of my bench rotation doesn't necessarily slot in properly with people they need to be on the floor with for as long as they need to be on the floor. Foul circumstances, it puts you in a position to where now you got to rotate people out of position because now guys have gotten foul trouble. If I bring certain guys off the bench, depending on how I'm starting, I may be able to, throughout the course of the game, manage my fouls better, put people on the floor where they can have some of their weaknesses masked a bit better, rather than pushing all of my best stuff to the front of the line, for which is traditionally something that everyone would otherwise think makes sense based on the basketball we've known. But as the game starts to evolve even further than where we start to see where it makes a lot more sense to do other things with your starting lineup, so that the course of 48 minutes you can have a rotation that best suits some of the players that otherwise are going to be on the floor later on. As we say, Austin Reeves and D'Lo likely shouldn't be on the floor together. We're finding Vando and Cam likely shouldn't be on the floor together. These different type of things miss and match all over the roster for any basketball team. So if you just push everything at the front of the line, you may find yourself in situations where you're using players you don't want to use in circumstances they're not better at. And if you have a complicated roster where certain guys play better when they're off the bench, certain guys play better when they start, and you can't seem to figure out how to make it all make sense because you're too busy trying to slot everything of your best stuff to the front, or make sure that positions are in place so that they are traditional, then a lot of times you're just going to let other aspects of what it is that ultimately needs to be taken care of go by the wayside. And I think that's what Darvin Ham is trying to do. He's trying to, within what it is that he believes works, do what he feels is best for the roster. Now, I don't agree with everything he's doing, but I also don't think he agrees with everything he's doing. He's mixing, matching, and trying to find stuff. So it's one of those situations where it's like last night, the Lakers won by 20-something points against a team that is very short-handed, who's not very good to begin with. I'm not going to sit here and say what he did was a success based on that win, because I don't think you can do that. Now, if he does it over the course of the next 7-8 games, and we win all of those games or win most of those games, then maybe you could say, okay, we found something, we're good. But after a win just the same, I can't sit here and make it seem as if I believe what he did was a massive failure. And I think that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people. It's like, because the guy I wanted to start didn't start, now it's a massive failure. And I just don't think that that's an accurate way of depicting what we saw. What we saw was guys being on the floor to really be more productive than they otherwise would have been in any other situation. That's what I saw. I saw a bench that scored over 60 points. I saw starters that had great plus minuses. I saw guys go out there and look better based on the fact that they weren't put next to certain guys that otherwise would have it, so that they trickle down from within the starting lineup to be put next to. And that is a complicated but very understandable thing when you look at it for what it was. Some of the rotations we saw yesterday I thought were really good, and I think it's Some of the guys we've seen have looked poor because of who they've been slotted next to. And you just don't have to trickle it down to something traditional just because starters are the best guys, the bench are the worst guys. It don't have to go that way. You can take advantage of different things and do well without that being something you are married to. You think about the Clippers from several years back when they had Trez and Lou Williams. Both of those guys were Sixth Man of the Year candidates, and their starters weren't half as good as them. But because of how they were structuring things there, they were able to attack that way, and that team was a playoff team, if I'm not mistaken. You know, when you look at certain, I mean, they didn't even win a championship, but like, there are other ways to do it. You think about back in the OKC days, back early, Westbrook, KD, James Harden days. Andre Roberson was a starting shooting guard. Nobody would think that Andre Roberson's better than James Harden. Nobody would think that he's better than Reggie Jackson, but they had him starting for defensive purposes. And he would only play like 10 minutes after starting the game. So it's like there's certain things that you can do that don't necessarily push all your best stuff to the front, that will allow you to strategize your rotations more fittingly for certain players who are going to need things, who need a facilitator, who need a rebounder, who needs shooting and stuff like that. And when you have a bunch of one-way guys, it's not as simple as putting all of my best stuff to the front, because you end up leaving holes on the floor and you end up being the worst starting team in the sport. And that's what we were doing. We had become the worst team in the first quarter in the history of the sport through 10 games because we had pushed a lot of stuff traditionally to the front that wasn't working. And we find ourselves down and then trying to find our way back up. And then as the season progresses, we start seeing, okay, this guy can't play with this guy needs to be with this guy. And it's like you can't just look at it and say, okay, well, because guys are playing out of position, now we just got to live with certain things not working out, when you can very easily make certain things work out if you just slot things a bit differently and start it a certain way so that it can trickle down another way. I think people look at basketball as starters, bench, but what it actually is a puzzle that trickles down certain ways. And I think that when you view it that way, then it's like, okay, well, if I start here, then it can get me there, as opposed to if I start here, it might only get me here. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's very complicated, it's very fluid, and it's much more complicated than I think a lot of people are understanding. And as my basketball understanding grows, my basketball knowledge grows, I realize that there's just too much of an emphasis placed on starting to begin with. And if everybody had an understanding that starting is not a demotional process or a promotional process, but more so a means of trying to get your basketball team off to not only a good start, but also make it so that your rotations trickle down to where you can manage both minutes and what is best for players to be on the floor, for which an emphasis is also placed on, then you know why a guy should not necessarily start just because it makes quote-unquote sense for starting purposes. And so I think basketball IQ and context is so very important for a lot of us, especially as talking heads who make a living off of speaking on the game. Our basketball IQ often isn't where it needs to be to know why we should think of something as acceptable or not. And if a coach loses a game, we can say, okay, that was a failure, but it might not have been as simple as that. And if you don't have all the elements of basketball in your mind, which no one really does as the game continues to evolve, then you may not necessarily know if something is quote-unquote working or not, especially when somebody's trying to pick and plug and try to figure out if something actually works. It is easier to critique a coach who does things consistently, but it's also easier to manage a basketball team when you've had them together for several years, for which a lot of coaches that we compare Darvin Ham to have had his team for several years. Now, granted, we've had this core. We've had Austin Reeves and certain players on this team have been here, but the majority of these players have not been together. And as I said, certain guys can't play with certain guys. It really don't matter if you've had 3 guys or 4 guys carried over, if the new guys are going to create new elements of need to try to figure out. So far from me being a Darvin Ham apologist, I definitely think that certain aspects of what he's doing, it's difficult for me to understand as I sit here and I try to assess it. But one thing's for certain, there's way too much of an emphasis placed on whether or not guys start or not. And it ain't about whether or not we think a guy is best or whether it's correct to start all your best guys. It's not like that. It's not as simple as correct. It's more so about what's going to trickle down to you being able to balance those minutes that need to be given to certain players based on their contractual obligations, for which is a process that's in the NBA that does affect the strategy a great deal. Probably shouldn't. Versus what's going to make those players look their best when they're on the floor. And if Barvingham is still a coach 5 years from now with the same roster, you best believe we're not going to have any of these problems. But in order for him to get to that point, we're going to have to go through this. The mix, click and plug, experimental, let me see what this guy can do. And so for me, it's just like, I don't like this process, but it does speak to us having so much turnover on our roster. Every time we see something not work, we want to make trades. And that type of stuff, while I support it because I'm of this era and I love seeing trades, it doesn't speak to your coach knowing what the heck to do with the rotations and what necessarily works for every guy on his team. You let him keep his team for a good 2-3 years and you start realizing cohesiveness goes hand in hand with consistency. You know, he gets that consistency, then he knows what works, he knows what doesn't, and he can keep that stuff in consistency. But you can't ask for consistency without allowing someone to first figure out what it is that works for the team. And if we're seeing something be historically bad, then of course he needs to figure something else out. And like I said, we got too many one-way guys, man. Too many one-way guys. Only play defense, only play offense. That's the problem. That is the problem. And so to find the right ones to mix and match and plug properly while dealing with the stuff that also comes with that, which is pressure. And I can imagine why Darvin's making certain mistakes. I can imagine why the team don't look as good as they should. You know what I mean? But everybody just has to either be patient and let this man figure it out, or continue to deal with the inconsistency of certain players that you want to see not start. But understand that that's not a sign of him not trusting those players, but more so trying to figure out what works for everybody. And so that's what I got to say about that. And y'all know I haven't been a fan of some of these rotations. I want to see Austin Reeves start. I do. I think he would be a fantastic starter in a lot of situations, but we also find that he's a fantastic bench player in a lot of situations. Do we want to let go of what is most consistent about that just so that we can promote him to the starting lineup when we know damn well we can get 20 points out of him every night off of the bench? He's the one consistent thing that we got. Him and on the bench equals success. It's been that way the whole time. So it's like you move him to the starting lineup to promote him. If you're viewing it through that lens, you may be having a worse bench because of it. Because now you're moving the most consistent thing off of your bench to your starting lineup as a means of promoting players when actually that's the wrong lens to look at it to begin with. It literally is. And another thing about Austin specifically is he's not the greatest ball handler. So if you want the ball in his hands to be the guard starting, if you look at moving all your best stuff to the front of the line, then he's going to be targeted by the starting units on the other side, who likely may be the best player or likely may be in a rotation that they've been in for several years. You know what I mean? And they're going to push him around and then take advantage of him defensively and all different types of stuff that maybe he doesn't have to deal with if he's dealing with second unit tiers of players coming at him. So it's like there's a lot of things to consider. I do not necessarily believe in putting all my forwards to the front of the line and saying, okay, we're starting like this. And the results are telling me it's probably not the best thing to do. Because if we're putting defensive lineups on the floor, the other team shouldn't be shooting over 50% in the first quarter, while we're shooting below 40% in both categories. And that's what you saw against the Charlotte Hornets. And when he started putting in other lineups that were better suited for success, we started seeing those lineups get us back into higher shooting percentages and getting those defensive numbers into a better space for the opponent. So if this, as it pertains to lowering their shooting percentages. So at this point, for me, I'm just like, okay, well, it's not about the starting unit working. It's about the bench units working and how he needs to find ways of making sure those bench units can attack lineups that they can exploit. You know what I mean? And if he's putting all that stuff to the front of the line, is it going to be the same result? Just because it worked against the bench unit of the Charlotte Hornets, do you think it's going to work against the starting unit of the Minnesota Timberwolves? It may. So I don't know. But the point is he's going to have to figure that out. And we're going to have to get it out of our mind that starting is the end all be all to a player's confidence. And a lot of players had this issue too because they, again, get perks for starting, and starting equals players obviously getting MVPs and all different types of stuff. You're not going to see an MVP come off the bench, but you're also not going to see a player that great get an MVP. You know, if he's starting or coming off the bench, if he is that great, he will be in the MVP race is what I'm trying to say. I worded that wrong, but you're going to see players be successful from whatever position they most succeed. And if the coach just allows for consistency, they will be in situations where you feel a bit more better about what you're seeing as a fan. But you have to let him get to that point. And right now, Darvin he's a new coach, second-year coach, with a brand new roster that keeps getting turned over every 6 months. Every time he learns the roster, they end up moving pieces around that makes him have to relearn the roster. So that's what it is, man. I don't want people to think that I don't believe that Austin should be starting. If I had things going, I probably want a guard in the lineup. And given the fact that D'Lo hasn't looked that great, obviously I want to put Austin in a position to get off to the best start and have us get off to the best start. But if it doesn't equate to that, what are you going to do? Move him back to the bench after starting him? You know, if he comes out and doesn't succeed, I mean, it's going to be more of the same. There's going to be more rotation circumstances that we don't appreciate. So, you know, I wanted to get up here and just kind of say that because at the end of the day, I'm hearing a lot of people getting on Darvin Ham after a 22-point victory because they didn't start certain guys. And I'm just like, man, that ain't the time to be jumping on nobody about the rotations. The rotations looked great yesterday. That's the thing. The starting unit did not. And that was very predictable. But when you start subbing in certain players after that lineup didn't work, you start seeing the rotations look probably as good as they looked all year. And the production showed you that it worked. So the start was bad. Everything that trickled after that was very good. And that can go a lot of different ways. If you start with your best stuff, it'll trickle down to be bad. You see what I'm saying? How that works? And now the units that come in after that ain't going to look as good. Now some of the stuff that you need in your bench is going to be in foul trouble because they're going to hunt them dudes in the start of the game. So you end up having a worse finish. You may get a lead and end up blowing it. You know what I mean? So it's like it goes a lot of different ways. But the point is we got to find stuff that works and use it more often so that consistency that makes everybody feel good can be in place and giving us the results that we want, which is going to make us a net positive on the basketball floor. So that's what I want to say, man. You know, this is not the day to jump on Darvin Ham about his rotation. He finally started Rui Hachimura, which I think makes sense based on the fact that Rui is a big-body player who can play defense, play offense. We need two-way guys in the starting lineup. You know what I mean? As opposed to going to Vando and Cam and D'Lo, all one-way players. You know what I mean? So it's like that's why it's an emphasis for me to put him in the starting lineup because he fits more in other units that trickle down. So once you start subbing other players in, he still makes sense. You see what I'm saying? And so that's why I think it's important to put him in there. I think of Austin as a defensive mind, but not a defensive player because he does get hunted defensively. He can end up being a net negative quite a bit defensively. But I think a lot of that has to do with some of the rotations he's placed in, who you put him next to in situations. So I know Austin can draw fouls, and he can help you rebounding the ball. And so there's a lot of things he can do defensively that really help the team. And then he's one of the most efficient shooters. So that makes him more likely to be someone that you want to see in the starting lineup. D'Angelo Russell's a better defender than people think. If you look at some of the defensive numbers, he really contributes there. He gets blocks, he gets steals. So I think that it trickles down to him being somebody you can accept defensively, even though he does to the eye test not necessarily pass. But nevertheless, you do appreciate that he can pass, facilitate the basketball with Anthony Davis, which makes him a very important player for what it is that we're doing. So, you know, if you remove him from the starting lineup, you start wondering if AD gets the ball, but what you realize is that he becomes a more efficient player in second units going up against lesser tier talent that's ultimately coming off the bench. So it's like maybe it makes a lot more sense to keep him in the second unit, forego whatever facilitating duties to AD he may provide, and then just find him next to AD in other lineups down the road throughout the course of the game. That makes sense to me. He could still find himself next to AD, getting all his passes to AD, and AD eats. But if you have him in the starting lineup trying to start these games, these defensive issues the eye test defensive issues start to, his physical limitations, his athleticism limitations start to glare, and puts a lot of pressure on him to hit shots, and the way that he needs to attack, he needs to be able to hit jump shots and get in rhythm, and that rhythm doesn't often come because the ball is going to other people. So he ends up being a guy who's just trying to find his spots to shoot in, and as a result, he tends to be 1 for 6, 1 for 5, or what have you, just trying to take set jump shots that just happen not to fall. He's not going to be very aggressive to force the issue to up his shooting percentage at the line. He ain't dunking on nobody or getting easy buckets. It's all jumpers. So if the jumpers don't fall, he's had a bad game, when really he was just picking his spots from a place of not so much confidence at that, next to players that likely don't make him look good. So it's like when you put him in the second unit, when he picks his spots, he's going up against lesser defensive players in certain situations. He can make plays and stuff like that, get in a better rhythm because it's not incumbent upon him to get the team off to a better start. He's not sharing the ball with LeBron James, which I think is an underrated thing. He probably shouldn't be on the floor with Bron very much. And so these type of things don't happen if you have to start him. You know what I mean? Bron is definitely starting. So it's like, you can keep him off the floor with Bron. I think that's an underrated statement. Bron and D'Lo probably shouldn't be on the floor together very much because D'Lo needs to orchestrate the basketball. Bron is going to take that away from him and force him to be a pick-a-spot shooter. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, if you're removing him from the starting lineup because of that, but you insert Austin into the starting lineup in his stead, what you end up finding is whatever the consistent production that Austin's providing you from the bench is now off of your bench and into your starting lineup. Maybe you need that consistency on your bench, as we've already stated. So it's like this is why you remove both of those guards in my mind. Though I don't love it, we don't have another option to guard after that. For those who want to see a traditional guard in the lineup, you don't have no other guards that you can trust in that situation. What, you going to go Jalen Hood-Schifino? You ain't ready. You know what I mean? And we don't have anybody else. Gabe Vincent's out. So I understand what Darvin's doing by removing guards from the lineup. I don't necessarily think it looks good to the naked eye. And if you look through the lens of starters equals better, then of course you're going to be unhappy. But if you ain't looking at it that way and you're just trying to start the puzzle piece for which everything trickles down properly, then you definitely understand what he's trying to do and can kind of give him a pass. He just needs to figure out other aspects of that starting lineup that make more sense than to leave us without anybody who can handle the ball outside of LeBron James. Forcing LeBron James to be more of a facilitator, for which we saw last night, him trying to get everybody involved because there was no guard on the floor. It doesn't allow him to go into his scoring bag, basically. And that's what you've been seeing against the Celtics and against this team, the Charlotte Hornets. Since we've been going without guards, he needs to get people set up. He is the only ball handler. So it doesn't allow him to score and drive to the bucket and get to the line and kind of take chances with his foul trouble. He doesn't have that ability. And as a result, his scoring goes significantly down. You see what I'm saying? So it's like we got to find that point guard. That's why I think the DeJounte Murray trade probably is going to happen if we can get him, because it can put us in a position to not have this problem. It removes D'Lo entirely from the mix. It can allow Austin to stay on the bench and still have some of these things trickle down and make a little more sense in theory. Depending on how much you have to give up to DeJounte, depending on what other elements come in now that DeJounte's in place, for which we would have to experiment some more to figure out. So it's like, it's a lot, man. It's a lot. I get it, though. And I want others to get it as well so that they don't find themselves frustrated looking at it through the starters equals better equals demotion or promotion lens, because that is a misguided NBA-created point of view that doesn't take into the evolution of the game. And what we've learned over the years really does work for rotations which need to have players getting certain minutes based on how much they're paid. So these type of things are... yeah, I get it. I just understand it. Basketball is complicated in the presence of all this business part of it. It makes it very complicated. It allows for people to sell the idea that starting equals better, equals should be paid more. But it doesn't necessarily strategize the course of a game or the course of a season properly, straight up. So that's what I'm seeing, man. That's what I'm seeing. I think Darvin Ham understands things that he hasn't had a chance to articulate to a lot of us. And I think what we're seeing is him trying to figure out how to make all that make sense. But when we get to the final place of where it is the team ultimately gets to, when we see our team at our best, we're usually somewhere farther than what we ever thought. That's why I'm frustrated, but I understand that. Darvin Ham is probably not as bad a coach as people paint him out to be, because at the end of the day, where do you end up? You won the in-season tournament. You got to the Western Conference Finals. Where's next? You know what I mean? And if we let him figure it out, maybe he can get us there. Especially with AD and Bron there. So I just think basketball IQ needs to be taught. Some of these agent business oriented ways of strategizing need to be forgotten. And we need to get into a space where we're looking at basketball as a bit more of a complex puzzle piece type of sport, rather than just this guy goes, that guy, they start, and then we're good. No, it doesn't. No, you're not. You're going to get beat once people start strategizing in more complex ways. So that's really what we've learned. That's what a lot of teams have learned over the course of championships being won, rather, that strategizing that way gets you beat as the game evolves. So I hope I articulated myself well. I know I messed up some of those words there, but I think what I'm trying to say is, just because the dude is starting, or just because the group is starting, doesn't mean that that's going to trickle down to you being better for the course of your game. And if we can do things the traditional way, past ways, you'll realize the game has evolved past that, and you're going to get beat. BDL 44. I thank you all for watching.